In the beginning things were unclear, right? A plane hits the building, and there was not a sense that it was deliberate for one, and it wasn't even clear that it was a huge jet, right? So, at first you think it's some accident of some small plane.
I would say at first there was no alarm because Jack Raslowski, the principal, came on the PA at what I remember to be a little before 9 in the morning, and he said he's just gotten a report that a small plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, and as details come in, he'd let us know more. Everybody almost expected, I guess, somewhere over the life of that building that a small plane would crash into it. It was almost not all that shocking. So there was no panic or alarm or whatever initially.
When the first plane hit, we heard it, but you have to understand there was construction going on down Exchange Place, so a lot of people thought it was the pile drivers. I mean, that's exactly what it sounded like. Just this really low thud, and you could almost feel through the ground, through it shaking the earth, I guess. And I'm not even sure if that's real, but it was sort of that low bass sound that the pile drivers make when they hit the ground.
Immediately we all assumed it was some sort of private plane gone off course, or some sort of mistake. Obviously it was some sort of mistake. And when the second plane hit, that obviously was no longer the case.
I was free in those first couple of periods that day, so I wasn't teaching at the time that the attacks actually occurred. I did see the second plane hit, and saw the fireball, and so that's when it began to sink in what exactly was occurring.
When I heard Bob Grant actually on the radio, which Ms. DeWitt had set up, I heard him talking about typical fire and brimstone stuff, like raining down death upon the people who did this. It's the first time I realized that this could have been a planned action.
I do recall at one point being on Broadway and a cab pulling over with the doors open and 1010 Winds, the old news radio station, blasting, how the Pentagon had just been hit. So by then it became crystal clear to me that this was not a freak accident. This was not an air traffic control issue. It was terrorism.
The freshman experience was an interesting one for my classmates because the faculty really asked us to step up and be more mature about the situation. Even though it was only our second day in high school, they really asked us to respond to the nation's tragedy in a positive manner. Emotionally, my fellow freshmen were all over the place. Some relatives were in the World Trade Center, some didn't know where their parents were. And as a freshman and only our second day of school, it was really hard for the freshman class to support each other. We come from different communities all over northern New Jersey. Nobody really knew each other. I knew about 1 or 2 kids in each of my classes. So to go through that experience as a freshman was difficult because I couldn't really support my fellow freshmen. I didn't really know who they were.
I remember thinking to myself, wow, if this is what's going to happen on my second day of school, what's the rest of the year going to be like? What's the rest of my 4 years going to be like in high school?
Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
That's when the second tower fell, and you could hear everyone screaming as they. It was actually, that's the most vivid memory I have of the situation. You could hear people screaming as they ran away from Harborside, just screaming, and you could just hear it in the air, and it was just so loud, and because the windows were open, and just running through the streets, and people, you could look out and just see them running down Montgomery. I don't know what they were running from, but probably would have been running too if I was in this situation.
At around 10:30 in the morning, I think it was by then the second or third period, or maybe recess, the closest I got in one sense to the destruction of that day was to suddenly hear this avalanche. And at that moment, I didn't really know what it was. And I remember a student, Bill O'Neill, who was a senior now, sitting right in front of me saying that the Trade Center is collapsing. And I don't think I would have put 2 and 2 together and realized that. And that's when it really struck me for the first time that morning, to hear it in this room. And I don't know if the room shook.
You heard it?
But you could hear it a mile away. You could hear the second tower. I don't remember hearing the first tower. Maybe that was the first tower to go down. But when I heard that noise, it sounded like coal going down a chute. when I was a kid, I remember coal being delivered and going down this metal chute and making a racket. And that's what it sounded like. And I remember O'Neill saying, the tower just collapsed. And that's when it really became real.
I do remember feeling the numbness of shock, though. At recess, I was going downstairs to out to the courtyard, and on the way I passed Joe Laverty, and he said that one of the towers was down, and I just couldn't believe this. And it wasn't just that; it was that this wasn't even possible. I didn't feel any emotion connected to even hearing this.
There was also part of me that sort of expected that there were going to be more attacks immediately following, and what were those going to be? I remember even thinking that as I was sitting up here in the classroom, and I certainly could see all the smoke billowing from Lower Manhattan. Is this sort of like the first, and now I've got your attention, and so now I'm really going to hit you?
It was an honest fear among me and other members of the student body that maybe these attacks weren't over. I remember going to the library, furiously trying to connect to the internet, to CNN.com, to find out if anything else had happened around the country, if this wasn't over. If, God forbid, what happened in New York had a biological component to it that was on its way across the area.
Once it became clear the magnitude of the situation, the first plane, the second plane, lots of concerns, right? I think there were certainly concerns about parents and relatives and friends and other family members of students and faculty in the building.
But the mood among the students was really a very mixed environment, a real mixed experience. Students were really in different places. Some were very upset. There were a number of students who had parents and other relatives working in Lower Manhattan, and so they had a real immediate concern about what was going on. Other students were less engaged with it. Some were, this was almost an exciting thing, that this was a big event that was occurring. And I think for a lot of us, because I guess I was in the same boat, you just could not really appreciate the enormity of what was occurring.
I remember Mr. Dandorf made the announcement when I was walking out of my art class, and my first thought was, oh my God, both my parents, they're supposed to be in the World Trade Center today. And I almost fainted out of fear because they're all I had, and I don't know what I would do without them. So I tried frantically to get through to them on my cell phone, but didn't have service, so I just got more and more scared. Thank God Miss Hellstrom had service that day, and I got through to both my parents, and I wasn't as scared.
We dealt with the first situation really by bringing those students together, making an announcement. Students who have parents or other relatives in the World Trade Center, inviting them down and trying to establish some sort of contact, right? Certainly outreach. Some folks were trying to reach folks on cell phones. Some students were calling home. Some students were calling other relatives. And I think the first level of care was for those students who were experiencing the potential loss of a family member, and then just as the rest of us were, wrestling with this terrorist attack and this tragedy that was happening and that was unfolding.
What we did was to have the chapel open. We let students know that they could spend as much time as they wanted in the chapel. Not only were the counselors available, but all faculty members were available just to be there to listen to students. And again, it was to let them know that they were important and we were there to listen.
If I can recall, we went to the chapel and we kind of had a little prayer service, not knowing what to do. And so we opened it up to anybody who wanted to come. And so, people came and just kind of shared a little bit in the chapel. In some way just trying to pray and trying to realize that, there was something beyond ourselves, that we needed God's help.
But there was no one way to react, even among faculty. I think back to the teachers. Some people just continued teaching that day. And I think a part of that was, where were you physically on the campus? For me, my room, for looking out to where the World Trade Center was sort of gave us a front row seat of what was happening.
The faculty trying to protect us basically attempted to continue classes as if nothing had happened, as if you could keep going on, and I think that's probably the healthiest thing you could do in that situation, because there was no way to explain it to the kids, there was no way to try to make it seem better.
We tried to keep things as normal as possible. We asked faculty to continue on with the day, but I think, you know, the faculty, while wrestling with the tragedy themselves, were really trying to respond to students as best they could.
It was by far the most difficult day of my teaching career, not to mention my life, but the most difficult day of my teaching career, because really for the very first time I had no idea of what possibly I could say to these students. My own feeling was, you know, what is happening to our world? And my own instinct was to head for the hills, you know, and to gather up the people who I care about and to be safe. And yet I found myself responsible for these 20-some students who were sitting in front of me and were at least as lost and confused as I was. And so what possibly could I say as a teacher? You know, it certainly wasn't the time to lecture people on, you know, dramatic events of the past, you know, terrorist attacks of the past, that kind of thing. It called out in me, you know, some sort of pastoral response that frankly I didn't really feel very equipped to do.
Mr. McDermott tried his best to calm us with the prayers he would customarily start class with. And as futile as it felt in combating all the things that we were feeling, the fact of the matter is he was so firm with his words and so desirous to be helpful in any way that we might continue on the class, that he by far sticks out most in my mind.
Personally, I was very grateful throughout this whole experience, really, for the leadership of Mr. Wazlowski. In a lot of ways, he got me through that day, September 11th, his announcements, kind of keeping us posted on the PA. You know, the reality is for most of us in our classrooms, kind of isolated, especially where I was, very isolated from the center of, you know, school activity and, you know, what's going on. He was giving us updates, how are people going to get home and all that.
When I think back to that day, I also remember Jack Wazlowski's leadership. I remember after school him speaking in the CAF, figuring out for everybody how everybody was going to get home. If public transportation wasn't running, then what routes they would walk that were safest, or that he advised them to walk. You know, here's a shortcut, here's something you may not have thought of, here's a good street to take.
He showed a side that was very different from what we'd usually see. And I think at that point, you know, I got into a better relationship, I guess, with Mr. Wazlowski.
When I think back on him and Mr. McDermott, I think that they show how pieces of the fabric that is prep were in place so that they responded so naturally and so well to this utterly unknowable catastrophe. And they really did. It was amazing to us students at the time, and it's still amazing to me now.
We sheltered on that first night about 16 adults who were dropped off on Jersey City streets by ferries and boats. And so we took them in. We gave them the shelter that night, fed them, found air mattresses for them, got clothing as much as we could find the next day, towels for showers. And one woman we pretty much helped for about 6 days. She could not get back to Manhattan. We eventually found housing for her, too. And the students who were here on that first, you know, the ones still around 3 o'clock, they helped blow up mattresses and fix up the cafeteria.
The whole cafeteria had been set up as a shelter, and we were just talking with people who had stayed there overnight. And they had talked, you know, there was one couple who were there with their dogs, and they had been evacuated from their Battery Park City hotel, or their not hotel, their condo, and just they spoke so vividly about that experience and how it happened. And they also spoke about what an amazing host that Jack had been the night before, setting up cots, going down to the wine cellar, seeing what he could find, you know, preparing this like last minute dinner. But it was pretty amazing just to spend time with the people who were here in the shelter.
I had to take time out and just say, Lord, give me that strength I need at this time, and also be able to reach out to those who are hurting.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of other recollections of that day. When school finally ended that day, I did go down to Exchange Place, and the smoke, of course, was still there. And I didn't have a camera, which I often do have with me here in the room, and I was glad of that in one sense. But I saw Father Tony Azardo down there with his camera, and I walked up to him, and he was getting ready to take a picture. And then I saw him, and he saw me, and he kind of put the camera back down, and he said, I just can't do this. It's somehow obscene to do this. And I had that same feeling. I felt a little better about the fact that I didn't have the camera, because I wouldn't have been able to use it anyway that day. There was just something so awful, so ghoulish in a way, to take a picture of that carnage.
I think afterwards I remember taking a camera down there, but I just felt that it was like intrusive to take a picture. So I didn't take any pictures. I normally take a lot of pictures of people, but I just felt it was like sacrilegious, you know, to take pictures of people who were coming across the river, or who were injured, or weren't doing well.
Truly one of the most incredible experiences of this event was at one point my cell phone, because it was working, I got a hold of a student's sister and mother, who he thought were both, he didn't know what was going on with them, and he had jumped to the conclusion of the worst, because it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But we finally got them, and the kid is a junior at the time, and broke down and cried. He was sitting in my desk chair and put his hands around my waist and was sobbing into my belly.
I don't think I would have been able to keep my, you know, defenses up and just keep myself completely emotionless if I'd seen other people breaking down. And I think my emotionlessness was the only thing that saved me that day.
And, you know, I think we all were going through, you know, immense changes. I remember going into Mr. Dundaro's office one day, about 10 days afterwards, and just really losing it with him. And, you know, I mean, I think we sort of cried together. Same thing with Mr. Murphy, same thing with Ms. Hellstrom.
In the days following, I can honestly say there's no other time in my life where, quite simply, I would rather have been asleep. It was just not a reality that seemed like anything I had ever known. It seemed like something I could function in. It was just so unstable.
There was a whole period of time where things just, every day things got worse. It wasn't necessarily the school, but my world just was worse every day.
We lost 6 alumni and the father of a current student, a student who has since left St. Peter's Prep.
On the 12th, I went out to visit the family whose son was a sophomore, and spent time with them. Father had worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. And I spent several hours with them, and a couple of days that week. And eventually they gave up hope, but at first they had hope. I also was in contact with at least 3 of our other families whose husbands died. In their cases, they were almost all by phone. And then And within a short, maybe, I forget the time, but maybe within the month, we had that several memorial masses here at Prep for various family members. The first one was standing room only.
That I was giving communion out on Grand Street. People could not get in.
And we've had the anniversary masses each year so far. We had the candlelight procession for the dedication of the flagpole and the monument at one of them.
I think the year afterwards, I think there were two services. There was one, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the courtyard. We had it in the courtyard, and Mr. McGordy came, who was a fireman, a retired fireman, and he gave a talk. There were people here with bagpipes just to recall that event. We had also students reflecting on, what happened to them on 9/11. And so it was something out in the courtyard. Everybody was seated. It was something that was done with a great deal of reverence.
I felt an incredibly strong need to present Islamic art and Middle Eastern secular art to my freshman students.
But certainly we gave more emphasis to Islam in the world civilizations curriculum. And we always understood on some level it's important that students understand what Islam is, and et cetera, but now there was a real urgency to what we were doing.
We listened to recitation of Quran, we look at images, we talk about the religion, we talk about the Middle East, we look at Persian miniatures.
I also introduced an elective which I had toyed around with a while ago called The World Since 1945. And part of the reason why I did that was the idea that by really focusing on history since 1945, that maybe would give us a deeper understanding of how exactly this has occurred, why this has occurred. And I feel pretty good about that. And I think that certainly I don't teach U.S. History 2, but I think the U.S. History 2 teachers also have spent a little more time on some of the foreign policy issues that might be connected to what happened on September 11th.
Why do people hate us so much? There has to be a reason. And is it our style of life? Is it our goodness? Is it a different way of looking at life? Why are we not liked in the world?
And I think it's incredibly important now more than ever that we really learn to be tolerant of each other.
In terms of the Prep History Lecture Series, the very first of the history lectures, which was in the fall of 2001 by Mr. DiLorenzo, was on the Middle East and the history of the Middle East to give some kind of context to what had occurred. And I was surprised. I really didn't expect a very large crowd. We had it in the library, but it was beyond standing room only. And so it indicated to me just how hungry people were to really understand what had occurred.
Shortly after 9/11, I met with my portfolio students, and we felt it was important to create a lasting image or a lasting memorial here at the school. So we created a mural that's downstairs in the entryway through the cafeteria to the main office. And I think that was helpful, as well as the art department sponsored poetry workshops that were oversubscribed. We had over 40 kids in this room wanting to write poetry about their feelings, and that was remarkable.
It didn't really sink into me or begin to sink into me what had happened until I got home and was able to turn on TV and really to see, as they kept repeating over and over again, how these events unfolded. What was going through my mind was that now everything is different. That this is one of those moments that I guess I had never really experienced in my lifetime, but had certainly taught about and read about, that somehow now everything is different after this point, and that we've entered some sort of new world, and what exactly does that mean?
And I felt like we were at war. This is something I haven't experienced, that many other people in the world have experienced, but I have not. And this is something that you can't lose your head. You have to stay calm, you have to figure out what needs to be done. So I went into that mode directly.
It's a really surreal number of days. I remember getting the New York Times the next morning on September 12th, and walking to the corner store and getting it, and I could look up in the sky and still see the smoke, you know, over Jersey City, and just so moving, the pictures of the memorials around the world, and for a brief moment, this idea that somehow the people of the world have been brought together. You know, images from Moscow and Havana and places that you'd expect to be, you know, friendly to Americans as well. There was a tremendous spirit that somehow humanity, we've crossed a line, and this is not what we want the world to be. And for me, one of the big regrets about all this is that we've lost that spirit so quickly, that brought not just Americans together, but really people all around the world.
I get more concerned about you know, the Iraq War.
The war as a direct result of 9/11 worries me, you know, and policies related to that worry me. Are we building peace or not? Are we making a more secure world? And I have, again, substantial worries.
It took a long time for me to come to grips with it, and that was probably months after. You know, in the meanwhile, I was, you know, thinking about it and trying to rationalize it and trying to put it through some of my thought processes, but there's no way to go about it. You just had to accept the grief that came with it, and eventually I did.
I would be lying to say that I'm over it, because I'm not. And I would be lying to say that it hasn't shaped the way I view my community. You know, if you scratch an inch, not even an inch, let's say a quarter of an inch beneath the surface, it's all there. And it's a very, very difficult time.
I had dreams of going through the terminal in New York. I never had a nightmare of the day itself in terms of the collapse or hearing that awful avalanche of steel. I don't ever want to hear that again in dreams or movies. And I haven't had any nightmares, thank God, of the destruction. But I have had dreams of going through the old concourse as if it was still there, and I can see every inch of that place. Having gone through it, I would guess 1,000 times in 30 years. I can see every inch of that plaza with the path and the 8 escalators, and the Warner Brothers store, and the Tourneau, and the Zabato Pizza, and the East River Savings Bank, and the Lamstons. I can still see all of those people even who work there. So that's a sad thing. That was about January of this year, and so it was. There were no words for it, especially since when you come out of the tunnel, you're in the pit, in the bathtub, in the hole where the towers were, and it's almost like a surreal roller coaster ride, because you're not on ground level, you're on whatever bridge of railroad tracks, and the path goes out into the daylight, and all of a sudden you realize this is it. It's just a big empty hole. So that was really a shock to expect.
Jersey City, just for a little background, is probably the most diverse city in the United States. And that's always been the thing that I've loved so much about it. It became very difficult shortly after 9/11 because things started to change a little bit. Like I have friends who, you know, like my beat cop and, you know, in the Jersey City Police Force, who confirmed that yes, indeed, when the planes hit and when the towers were falling, that there were people celebrating in downtown Jersey City. And for me, that was very incongruent because so many of my friends and neighbors either narrowly escaped or died. Right. And that was a real hard thing to marry, to figure out how I could mentally get past that. In fact, a friend, not really a friend, more of an acquaintance that we had met, who was Egyptian, and he was shortly thereafter apprehended, and from what I understand, he was apprehended for selling shoulder rocket launchers to bin Laden. And he, again, a neighbor. Another neighbor who ran a liquor store was also arrested. I don't know, I think he might have been Pakistani, but I'm not sure of his origin. mean, one of my dear, dear friends and workout buddy was in World Plaza 7 and ran for her life. You know, another dear friend who lives catty corner from me, you know, took refuge with a family in a subway downstairs, you know, just ditching down into the subway stairs while people were falling from the sky. Another good friend, and these are people who all live within 2 minutes walk of my home, was coming up the big elevator, the big escalators in the PATH station, and a 50-foot chunk of the ceiling landed, you know, less than a foot from her head. So these are the stories. These are the people who I know. These are my friends. My experience was not something of watching it on TV or even standing on Grand Street watching this. My experience was when I wasn't calling for the students, I was trying to find my friends and see if they were alive. And then to hear that people, you know, maybe a few more blocks away from me were celebrating the, you know, the really unhappiness and the sheer horror of this day was very difficult.
Well, it's one of the most vivid memories of my life. I was in New York City with my mother and my brother, and we had gone to the Roxy Theater to see a movie and a stage show. And we came out of the theater, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We'd been in there about 2 to 3 hours. And in the lobby of the theater, there were all kinds of handwritten signs saying, "Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. All servicemen report to your bases and ships." But the interesting thing is that everybody was startled and shocked, but there was no great sense of fear, so far away that there didn't seem to be any immediate threat of anyone attacking us. You had a great sense of fear at 9/11 that I didn't feel at Pearl Harbor, for the reasons I already mentioned. It was so far away, and it seemed like a purely military conflict. But this war, where civilians are the targets, I think has created especially if you've had some experience with the military as I have. I've written a history of West Point, and I know a lot of generals and higher ranking officers in the Army, and I've talked to them about this. And this is very serious business. These people are not content to defeat us in battle or something like that, which, you know, at all events we would have remained an independent country. There was not much chance of the Germans or the Japanese really invading us during World War II. Right. So it was really, can we defeat them overseas? And that reduced the personal fear, unless you were in the service and you were on the edge of going into battle. People did get pretty jittery then, but now this war has added a dimension of fear, I think, to the civilian population that was simply absent in the past. And you realize that from 9/11, but also from reading the papers and the threat of poison gas attacks and chemical weapons of that sort. All these are part of this terrorist apparatus. And I really think that it has to be confronted and defeated.
I was commuting to St. Peter's from the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a very ordinary commute at that time. I was Father Keenan's assistant and director of development. I had moved from St. Peter's to the St. Ignatius Loyola Parish Rectory because I was also a graduate student, and my thought was I wanted to be a little bit closer to my dissertation advisor and to the library. I was a student at Teachers College at Columbia University. You know, I got into the subway here at 86th Street, I say around 9:20. And the train pulled out at 86th Street. It was an express train. When we arrived at the Fulton Street train station, the conductor told the passengers, including yours truly, that there was a fire at the World Trade Center. And so my first reaction was one of annoyance. that I was going to be inconvenienced, that you know, I was wondering, was the path running from the World Trade Center over to Exchange Place? Would I have to schlep over to the west side and get a path on 9th Street or Christopher Street in order to get to New Jersey that day? You know, this was sort of messing up my schedule. When I left the train station, I did not know, you know, what was really going on. And as I got onto the street, this was on Fulton Street, the South Tower was hit. So I remember looking up and, you know, not really being able to put together what was going on. I was dressed like this. I was dressed in clerics, and so I saw a police officer rushing down Fulton Street. It's very chaotic, as you can imagine, and so I said to her, "Excuse me, officer, I'm a Catholic priest. Can I help you?" So she said, "Yeah, Father, come with me." And so we ran towards the World Trade Center, towards the North Tower. We arrived on the scene, and it was, you know, pretty horrific already. And this was around 9:10 or 9:15, and you know, it was evident that people had begun to jump. And it's amazing that here it is nearly 3 years later and it's still so upsetting and so vivid. It didn't dawn on me that people were jumping, that for a while it was debris. It just was so surreal. When it finally did hit me, I had counted 14 people who had jumped. There are words that a priest says during confession. They're the words of absolution, the prayer of absolution. So I just remember looking at the North Tower and the South Tower and making the sign of the cross and saying those words and deciding not to look back. I proceeded north on Broadway. I got to Duane Street. I was walking with a young man who said that he had just walked down 80 flights of steps. This was, you know, sometime at this point had passed. And with that we heard a lot of screaming. And I turned around and there was a huge wall of smoke coming up Broadway, advancing towards us. We started running, and I lost track of the gentleman I was walking with. I remember hearing a voice yelling, "It's the end of the world." And I thought, well, it's probably not the end of the world, but it may be the end of my time in the world. I decided to walk back up here. That evening after dinner here, I again remembered what that police officer had said to me, so I walked from here, 83rd Street and Park Avenue, down to the 20s on the east side, farther east, to Bellevue. It was a day of a lot of walking for me, and or running. And when I arrived at Bellevue, this woman, a doctor, approached me and she grabbed my arm and she said, "Where have you been?" And so I said, you know, "Excuse me, I didn't recognize her. I didn't think I knew her." And so she said, "I have an ER filled with Irish Catholic firemen, and I have no Catholic priest here." So I said, well, you know, here I am. And so for about 3 hours that night, I really went from bed to bed to bed. There were a lot of guys who were there with respiratory problems from being there that day. There were a number of men in shock. They all wanted to either have their confessions heard or receive the last rites, or both. You know, many of them had very grisly stories to tell about witnessing their colleagues being killed in the World Trade Center. You know, I mean, I heard about a beheading. I heard about people who were there, you know, a minute ago, and then after one of the towers collapsed, gone. I heard about finding limbs. So it was really, you know, it was grotesque, but it was also great to be there. So that was really my experience of the day. The rest of the experience was very much St. Peter's Prep oriented.
I had dropped my son off at a railroad station to go into New York because he's a student at Stevens Institute of Technology on something called the co-op program, where they get you a job for every other semester, and you work one semester and you go to school one semester. And they got him a job in the World Trade Center. And his second day on the job was September 11th in 2001. And they got him a job for a company called Marshall McLennan, which was on the 95th floor. And his workday starts at 8:45 in the morning. I think it happened at 8:47, and I know my son got to work about that time. So I immediately went home to find my house filled with friends and relatives who knew that my son was working at that place at that particular time. And we spent the next 3 or 4 hours, as I guess most of the world did, watching the events of that day, and then finally watching the World Trade Center crash down, thinking our son was in it. We got a call about 3.5 hours later from one of his friends who had finally gotten through to his cell phone, and he had reached Staten Island. He had the foresight to immediately get off New York at that point, run like the Dickens with some other guy, get on a Staten Island ferry, and headed out away from Staten Island. He was 5 minutes late for work that day. And he was in the lobby waiting for an elevator to go up to the 95th floor. And I believe that there was no one left from his company. I think that 9/11 had a major impact on a lot of people's lives, both sad and good. In our case, it could have been horrible from a personal point of view. But on the other hand, it made us realize as a family what was important. It made me realize what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I left the business world very quickly after that, or very soon after that, and got an opportunity to come back here to prep. So I don't think I would be at prep today, teaching, having a great time with the freshmen. And I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't happened for 9/11. So as tragic as it has an impact on some people's lives, I think it makes other people realize that there's some good can come out of it.
It was a horrible thing, yet I think one thing that makes horrible things better is being able to walk that road with people you know, people who care for you, in a place where you feel secure, in a place for so many of us where not only where the bonds of community and family are alive, but the bonds of faith. You know.
I can't think of another time where every prep student was literally like a brother.
St. Peter's was remarkable and really a great place where people found solace and strength during those travel weeks and months afterwards.
I thought it was a great idea on the part of St. Peter's that they communicated with the graduates and they told how this affected St. Peter's and the people, the students in the school, and everybody else, graduates and so forth, who were involved in this tragedy. You know.
In the midst of this terrible tragedy, you know, prep was at its best. And the darkness will not cast out the light was my big phrase from those days, and I think it's true. I think those bedrock. That bedrock of prep, that foundation upon which we build, you know, is what continues to allow us to be a great institution.